Hello, students. So, this screencast, we are going to look at taste and smell. Now, to start off, um, I really wish I could do this in person with you, but alas, I cannot. What I normally do in class is I will give each kid a Jolly Rancher, but I don't tell you what flavor. I have you close your eyes, hold out your hand, and then I give you a Jolly Rancher of unknown flavor, and then children say, "Don't give me a green," and then maybe I accommodate that depending on how much I like the child. Anyway, so what I do is I say, "Close your eyes and pinch your nose shut." And if you have Jolly Ranchers or some other hard candy, you could still try this. Close your eyes, pinch your nose shut, and then unwrap the candy and just put it in your mouth and just suck on it for a while with your nose pinched. Do not let your nose become unpinched. And the challenge is to figure out A, is this a sweet Jolly Rancher or a sour Jolly Rancher? And B, what is the flavor of the Jolly Rancher? And after kind of plugging the nose and kind of swishing that thing around for about 30 seconds, most of the time kids can tell either I have a sweet or a sour Jolly Rancher, but they can't tell the flavor, and it's troublesome to them. And then I say, okay, release your nose, and everyone lets go of their nose, and all of a sudden there is just this rush of flavor that just comes pouring in, and you're like, ah, I have grape. And it's pretty cool. So if you could try this with just about anything. Hard candy works pretty well. Um, but try it to experience it. And so the question is, why? Why does this happen? Why is it that when your nose is pinched, you can't identify the flavor very well, but you can tell if it's sweet or sour? And then why does unpinching your nose allow that flavor to rush in? Well, understanding that is really key to understanding taste and smell. P.S. You may be wondering, wait, sour Jolly Ranchers? They don't exist anymore. They used to exist, but now they don't. So now I just lie to kids and say, hey, guess which one you have? And they all have the sweet. Anyway, so let's start with taste. When you put that Jolly Rancher in your mouth, it's going to begin to dissolve in your saliva. By the way, fancy word for taste, gustation. So, you can see that kind of dissolving there and sticking to this kid's tongue, right? So taste actually does take place in the tongue. So if you can go in a mirror and just kind of in front of the mirror and look, and you can see these little bumps on your tongue. And if you zoom in on one of those bumps, there's actually this little groove around the top. And if you take that tongue surface and then just kind of rotate it like that, what you'll find is that groove, that circular groove along the top, it actually descends down into the tongue. And lining that circular groove all the way down here are what appear to be little garlic bulbs. And yet these garlic bulbs have this little yellow line attached. That suggests a nerve. That tells you these are important. These garlic bulbs are actually the taste buds. And the taste buds are the chemoreceptors that are involved in processing taste. So this is where the magic happens. Those chemoreceptors, those sensory receptors that convert the energy of a stimulus into an action potential. So the way it works is it's simply a molecule binds to a specific taste bud, and then that initiates an action potential. So here's our taste bud. There's this little receptor area here, and then a particular molecule labeled FA, I don't know why, binds to that, and then that's what triggers an action potential to be fired. So that signal then travels to the thalamus, which is the relay station for all your senses that we've talked about. And then it goes to the cerebrum for processing, and you actually in your parietal lobe have this little what's called gustatory cortex, which is what makes sense of taste. So this little part of your brain is responsible for figuring out the taste. There's actually 5 different tastes, and that's it, only 5: sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami, which is probably the least known. But it's in soy sauce and Parmesan cheese, and sometimes people call it savory. Umami, it was actually discovered in Japan, and so that was the Japanese name for it, but it's just a cool name, so it stuck. So that's it, 5 tastes. So getting back to our Jolly Rancher, the information that taste provides your brain is just, is this sweet? Is it salty? Is it sour? Is it bitter? Is it umami? And so since the Jolly Rancher was sweet, little sugar molecules bound to those taste buds and told your brain this is sweet. Um, but that's it. It doesn't send any information about the flavor of the Jolly Rancher. It can just tell us that it's sweet. So that's where smell comes in. Fancy word for smell is olfaction. And basically, as that Jolly Rancher is dissolving, this is the mouth, and this is the inside of the mouth, and as you're sucking on it, some of the molecules in that Jolly Rancher will evaporate and turn into a gas. And it turns out there's a connection in the back of your throat, it's called the pharynx, that connects your oral, your mouth cavity, with your nasal cavity. And so these molecules that dissolve from the Jolly Rancher will kind of make their way up into your nasal cavity. And so you're also simultaneously smelling that Jolly Rancher while it's in your mouth. So let's look at the anatomy there. The key group of cells here are olfactory cells. These are the chemoreceptors for smell. And just like before, a specific molecule is going to bind to that chemoreceptor, and that's going to initiate an action potential. So here we have a rose, and we're smelling a rose, and little molecules from that rose are going to make its way into our nasal cavity. And then at the top of our nasal cavity, if we zoom in on this area, we see that this is the skull, and poking through the skull, there's these little holes in this particular part of the skull. And if we were in class, I could show you those holes in a model skull. There's little cells poking from the brain and sticking out, and those are the olfactory cells. And so the molecules bind to those and then send a signal to the brain. These cells synapse directly onto olfactory bulbs, which maybe you remember from our last unit, these little circular areas right there. So, excuse me, just like taste, it's a specific molecule that binds, and then that sends a signal to your brain. Note that the thalamus is not involved. Smell is the only sense that does not go through the thalamus. The olfactory bulbs take that information, and then they send it to what is called the olfactory cortex, which is right about here. It's on that, it's actually in the temporal lobe here for processing. So how do we then distinguish odors? How do we know what flavor our Jolly Rancher is? Well, it turns out that you have lots of different olfactory cells. So in this diagram, we have a green, a blue, a red, and a blue. There's many more than that, about 400 types, we think. But for this example, you have 3 different types of olfactory cells, and each is going to have different receptors that are sensitive to different molecules. So if you have a little red molecule down here, it only is going to bind to the red cell and stimulate that. And then that red cell sends a particular signal to the brain that says, hey, this one's cherry. And there's little green molecules that will only interact with the green cells, and they'll send a different signal to the brain saying, hey, this is green raspberry, green apple. And then maybe there's another type of molecule that only stimulates the blue cells that sends a signal to the brain that says this is blue raspberry. So it turns out that molecules can stimulate cells individually or in combination. So, estimates are that there's about 400 types of olfactory cells. And so by stimulating those individually and in combination, that's like 1 trillion different smells that you're capable of, which is a lot of smells. What's interesting about this is that each smell that you experience is because it fits into these little molecules in a different way, which really means that the origin of smell really is the shape of the molecule. So here's the molecule that makes up vanilla. And maybe you remember from chemistry, every little junction here represents a carbon atom. So carbon, 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 carbon. This is an oxygen with an O. That's vanilla. So if that molecule binds to the appropriate olfactory cell receptor, it will send a signal to your brain that says vanilla. And if this molecule binds to its appropriate receptor, that sends a different signal to your brain that says garlic. So ultimately, smell is just based on the shape of the molecules. And if you've heard of artificial colors and flavors, that's how it works. If scientists are like, hey, we want a raspberry flavor for our product, they might start with this kind of molecule and then figure out if they can modify it in different ways to kind of create a different type of raspberry. So to recap, we have 5 tastes: sweet, salty, bitter, sour, umami, but thousands of smells. And that is why we couldn't really detect the flavor of that Jolly Rancher until we unplugged our nose. When our nose was plugged, those molecules couldn't get to those olfactory cells that that tell us what flavor it was. So really, much of what we consider taste is actually smell. When you're experiencing the flavor of food, it really is mostly smell that we're experiencing. Okay, some fun facts, interesting stuff. First of all, notice if you compare the sheep brains that we dissect in class with a human brain, those olfactory bulbs are very different, which different sizes, and that tells us that humans have a pretty lousy sense of smell. Here's a dog. A dog's olfactory bulb, boom, versus humans, boom. 300 million olfactory receptors, those chemoreceptors, versus 6 million in humans. So our sense of smell is rather pathetic compared to our canine friends. The other thing I wanted to make sure we point out is that taste and smell are adaptive. Natural selection acts on taste and smell. So if something is desirable to us, that means it must have helped our ancestors to survive. So I'll give you an example of this. If you put a dead fish in a yard, you will soon find flies buzzing all over that thing. Dead things smell glorious to flies. And you might think, how is that possible? Well, flies lay their eggs on dead things. Those eggs then develop into larvae that then feed on that dead thing so that they can grow and metamorphose into adult flies. So dead, rotten things are disgusting to us because they will make us sick if we eat them. So natural selection caused us to be repulsed by this. Um, Flies, it's desirable. Like, woo, dead things, yay, let's go lay our eggs, and off they go. So there's certain ways to look at this for humans. There's certain foods we universally crave. Sweet is one of them. And the reason why we love sweets so much is because sugars provide energy. And so in nature, fruits have sugar, they provide energy, and it's kind of hard to come by in nature. You don't see wild fruit just all over the place out in the wild. So when humans find it, they're like, ah, they want to gorge to get as much as possible. And our ancestors did that, the one, and then survived and passed that on. And so craving sweet things is something that our brains have been evolving to do for millions of years. But it's backfiring because now when we think of sweets, this is what comes up. Food manufacturers have figured out, hey, if we load our product with sugar, then people will buy a lot more and eat a lot more. And boy, does it work. Here's just some fun facts. The average American eats about 88 pounds of sugar a year, which is about 18 5-pound bags. And you might think, well, that's a year. Maybe that's, sure, over a year. But here's the recommendations, much smaller numbers. Another way to look at this, 1 can of Coke has this much sugar. That's a lot. And the result is huge increases in obesity, diabetes, and other illnesses associated with overconsumption of sugar. So we've kind of evolved to crave sweets, but now it's killing us. Progress. We also crave salty things. And salt is important because it provides electrolytes. Sodium and potassium, we saw, play a really important role in the nervous system. And salt, we crave a lot as well. Even looking at this, you're thinking, I want some McDonald's fries. Here's a map of all the McDonald's restaurants. Salt is really the key to McDonald's success, and they're everywhere. I mean, there's like a whole Hawaiian island devoted to McDonald's according to this map, which isn't really reality. The reason we crave it so much is because it's really hard to get. And so this is just kind of an interesting little video clip that shows animals trying to get salt. And salt can be mined out of caves. If you're not near the ocean, it's hard to find. And so there's this cave in Africa where these animals they travel for tens of miles every day to get to this cave, and then they just lick the salt. And they need the salt that bad that it's worth doing that. So predators, prey, go to this pitch black cave in the middle of the night to lick salt. So salt is hard to come by, which is why we crave it so much. And again, it's backfiring. High blood pressure, stroke, heart disease are all associated with too much salt intake. So it's, I think, helpful to understand how our brains are wired so that we can understand that, certain foods are sort of intentionally crafted to make us crave them and desire them. So fight it, children, fight it. That's it for taste and smell. We'll pick up with hearing and vision in the next screencast.